Great, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our last lecture for at least this part of Unit 5. When we return in January, we're going to go ahead and jump into the Industrial Revolution, which is a completely different type of revolution here. So here's our last political revolution, and this will be the revolutions of 1848. As a quick reminder, we've already gone over the Enlightenment, so the justifications for these revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Latin American revolutions. This series of revolutions is going to take place all over Europe. So I'm just going to give you a general overview of it, but it's going to take place in France and Italy and Hungary and Austria. All of these different countries. We're not going to look at each country individually because that would take way too much time. We're just going to give a quick overview of it. Let's go ahead and begin with our essential questions. What were the causes and effects of the political and social revolutions during this time period? And why did nationalism begin to rise? And what were the positive and negative effects of it? Today, we're specifically going to be looking at nationalist movements in both Italy and Germany. Let's go ahead and begin with this. So when we were last in Europe, we saw that Napoleon had conquered Europe. He had taken it all over. He had spread the ideas of the Enlightenment to everyone in Europe, with the exception of Russia, because he couldn't get all the way to or he barely got all the way to Moscow. And then we saw that Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to St. Helena. Well, now everything needs to be put back together because Europe, the entirety of it, is in a complete mess. In stepped Clemens von Metternich, who I'll just refer to as Metternich. Now, he is from Austria, and he's the right-hand man to the Emperor of Austria. And so what Metternich does is he works with all of these countries, Russia, Prussia, France, Britain, everyone, in order to reestablish the balance of powers. What Metternich sees is that Napoleon and these Enlightenment ideas are bad because they upend the social order. You can't let random serfs and just everyday people vote and make decisions. These people can barely read and write, let alone understand very complicated and complex political issues. And so Metternich wants to put everyone back in the box. What he wants to do is return everything back to normal, just pretend like Napoleon and the Enlightenment never, ever existed in the first place. And that's exactly what he does. He puts the absolute monarchs back on the thrones. Now, there are going to be some changes. The Holy Roman Empire, instead of being fractured into 140 different separate societies, is now 39 separate German states. So they're still all very separate from one another, but they're starting to consolidate. They're starting to come together a little bit, as we'll see, and we'll see how important that is a little bit later. But know that pretty much Metternich is trying to wipe out everything that Napoleon did and set it back to zero. We're going to see that, yes, you can put kings back on the throne, but you can't change the minds of the people. Once they get a taste of a republic, once they are exposed to the ideas of religious tolerance and being able to vote and having freedom like that, you can't just take that away from them. They'll always want that. We'll see that there is fighting for independence between the years 1815 and 1848. So the first one is the Decembrists in Russia. The Russians protest the coronation of Tsar Nicholas I because they wanted his brother Constantine. Constantine was a little less conservative and would have allowed for more rights for the people. Nicholas I says, no, I'm not going to step down, and he suppresses the uprising and sends the Decembrists to Siberia, to one of the coldest parts in the world. What we see here and what we'll see in the future is that Russia is going to be backwards. Russia is going to be behind the rest of Europe in terms of freeing the serfs, in terms of allowing people to have the vote, in terms of not having an absolute monarch. And so that is going to play a huge role in Russia all the way up through World War I. As we'll see, Russia is going to be the last country to get rid of feudalism and be the last country in Europe to get rid of the absolute monarch. In France, they have another revolution. People in France have a revolution just like you and I breathe. They just have it all the time. That's just what people in France do. If you look at French history, it's just revolution, revolution, revolution. It doesn't even matter what the government is. They just want to revolt. Well, let's move on so that way I don't offend all of my French viewers. So in 1830, they overthrow Charles X, who is this absolute ruler, and they put in Louis Philippe. who is a constitutional monarch. Once again, this is a very moderate change. It's still a monarch, but it's a constitutional monarch. Louis Philippe is limited by the Constitution. It's a rule of law society where the Constitution's at the top, not the rule of man society where the king or the absolute monarch is at the top, and 1% of the population can vote for representatives. That doesn't seem like much, but you have to remember that under an absolute ruler, that number was zero. So 1% is certainly better than that. We also see Ottomanism or Ottoman nationalism. We see that the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. At this point, starting to become the old sick man of Europe. And we'll discuss that more in Unit 7. But in order to keep the empire together, the Ottomans want to institute Ottomanism, which is let's minimize the ethnic differences between all of the people in our multi-ethnic society, and let's all identify as Ottomans. And so they start to control the schools, they start to control the curriculum in order to get people to identify as Ottoman. This greatly upsets many of the countries in the Balkans. Now, they're not countries yet because they're still in the Ottoman Empire, but many of the ethnic societies in the Balkans, think where Greece is today. And so eventually you have Serbian independence in 1817, and you have Greek independence there in 1831. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing more and more nationalism. We're starting to see people go against their kings, go against their monarchs again and again in order to gain their own nation, or at least be able to vote and be able to represent themselves in some way. We also need to think about the lead up to the revolutions of 1848. So, at first, we have the political desires of the nobility and the upper middle class. The nobility and the upper middle class see themselves as very intelligent and very wealthy, but they don't have governmental power. And they really want that governmental power. They want to be able to vote, they want to be able to have those jobs in the government. And so, what they want to do is they want to change things to a constitutional monarchy, not an absolute monarchy. So that way they can have some of those governmental positions instead of letting the king do everything. They namely do not want a radical republic. So these are fairly moderate individuals. Contrast with that with the peasants and the factory workers, they absolutely want a republic. They are the radical part of the revolutions of 1848. And the reason they want a republic is because they they work really hard. They work in the factories, they work in the fields, and they can't buy things. I mean, food prices are incredibly high. They have absolutely no rights. They're taxed, all these horrible things. So they say this system isn't working at all. We can't just have little moderate change. We need a radical change in order to get that done. Now, what eventually kickstarts the revolutions is the same thing that always kickstarts the revolution. You can have people who are mad. You can even have people that are unified, but it has to get to a point where it's a life or death situation before people actually start to revolt. And you get that with the Irish potato famine. Now, what I have here is a picture of me at the Idaho Potato Museum. That is a real museum. It is there. I did not have a chance to go inside because it wasn't open, but you could go up to Blackfoot, Idaho, and you can go in there if you choose to do so. The reason I put that there is because you had the Irish potato famine. This potato famine hit Ireland very hard. Obviously, that's why it's called the Irish potato famine, but it also hit the rest of Europe very hard as well. And the rest of Europe just doesn't have food. And since they don't have food and food prices are incredibly high and it's a life or death situation, now they want to revolt. What we're going to see is that the moderates and the radicals team up in order to overthrow the conservatives, and they're successful in doing so. But then, as we've seen with other revolutions, the moderates do not satisfy the needs of the radicals. And so the radicals get mad and they want to overthrow, but the radicals aren't organized enough. It's this odd dichotomy where the moderates need the radicals because the radicals have a whole lot of people, and you need a lot of people in order to engage in a revolution. But the radicals need the moderates in order to actually organize and also bankroll everything, because the radicals aren't the ones who have money; it's the nobility and the middle class. But when you separate those two, the revolution doesn't work. And once the moderates get in power, the radicals want things to be changed. The moderates say, well, no, we're not going to allow you to change. We're not going to allow a republic in here. And so they get rid of the radicals. This gives an opportunity for conservatives to come in and retake what they had lost in the revolution. So we'll actually see a counter revolution in which the conservatives say to themselves, okay, the moderates no longer have the manpower, so we can retake everything. What's interesting to me about the revolutions of 1848 is that all of this fighting occurs, and yet there's almost no change, no at least direct change. We'll see some of the long-term impacts, but there's no direct change because they aren't able to necessarily take over. I'll give you a couple examples here. One is in France. So in France, they overthrow the July monarchy. This leads to a second republic headed by Louis Napoleon III. That's great. Wonderful. We have a republic now. But then Louis Napoleon in 1851 makes himself emperor. He knows that there's no way this republic is going to stand. And so he's able to he's able to stop the revolution and retake what he had lost and make himself emperor. Same thing with Austria. The moderates and the radicals team up to get rid of Metternich. They throw him out. They get rid of him. They establish a constitution. They get jobs for the intellectuals. They tried to help the economy, but then the moderates and the radicals split up. The radicals say, no, we want a republic. The moderates say, absolutely no way. The conservatives who want an absolute monarchy say, this is our time to shine. We're going to go ahead and retake what we have lost because they can defeat the moderates. And so what we see is that the gains made by the revolution are going to be lost, and the absolute Emperor Franz Joseph will be put back on the throne. This happens in Hungary. This happens in Germany, or really in Prussia as well, is where the revolutionaries make gains. But once the moderates and the radicals split, the conservatives come back in and retake everything. In order to really kind of point this out or kind of make it at least a little more clear, let me give you an example here. So let's pretend that if you were in class, it would make more sense, but I think it will work. Let's pretend we have Miss Delgado, who is the principal here at Rancho High School. Let's pretend that she is an absolute ruler. She rules everything. She's the only one who makes decisions. No one else can make decisions other than her. There's no constitution. There's no laws put in place. Nothing like that. It's just her. Then you have the teachers, like me. The teachers are kind of like the nobles. We want some moderate changes. We want Miss Delgado to be ruled by a constitution, and we want to be able to have a say in things. So we're more of the moderates. We're like the nobles. The radicals would be like the students. The radicals are the ones who say, you know what? We don't like Miss Delgado. We don't like the teachers. Our school should be run by the students. You can clearly see why the moderates, the teachers, would absolutely hate the radicals. They might use the radicals in order to overthrow the emperor, in order to overthrow Miss Delgado. But once they have that power, they're going to turn the radicals and say, no, 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 no. We're the ones who can read. We're the ones who can write. We're the ones who have the money and the power. You guys are all crazy and way too radical. You need to be put back in your place. That's what's going on here. Now, what Miss Delgado would see is that she would see the moderates fighting against the radicals, the teachers fighting against the students. And what she would do is say, well, look, I know the teachers don't have any power because they don't have the students. And I know the students don't have any power because they don't have the teachers. So I can come back in and be the principal emperor. And that's exactly what she would do. And that's exactly what these leaders do as well. I know all that is incredibly confusing, and there's a lot with the revolutions of 1848, but hopefully that analogy helps to make a little more sense, that all of these revolutions are occurring, but there's no drastic change. It's the revolution that refuses to turn is one of the phrases that many historians use. We also see that the Italians are still divided. So this idea of a unified Italy still does not exist yet. We'll see in just a second that it will. Italy is still divided up and controlled by or at least the northern part is controlled by the Austrian Empire. Now, they tried to unify in order to get rid of Austria, but they failed to do so. Even though they failed to do so, it doesn't mean that this isn't important. And I'll talk about that in just a second. The Germans act in the same way. They're still divided, and they tried to rebel against Prussia in order to implement a constitution and German unification. But once again, it fails. Just because it fails doesn't mean it's not important. Here's why the revolutions of 1848 are important, even though they fail to really accomplish much. One, the ideas of nationalism and unification spread, especially in Italy and Germany. Yes, Italy isn't unified in 1848, and neither is Germany, but the idea is there. And ideas, as I've said before, are like seeds. You got to plant them, and then you got to be patient. You have to wait. And if you wait long enough, eventually you're going to get something coming out of the ground. We also get new political groups who demand more power for the people and more political awareness by workers and peasants. The workers and the peasants weren't aware that they had political rights. They weren't aware they had rights at all. I mean, think about your average daily worker. Think about even yourself. You come to school. Well, back in the day, you would come to school, but you virtually go to school and you sit there and you take notes. You don't think necessarily about your political rights. You don't think about, oh, okay, are these students like me? Can we organize together in order to get more political rights? You just don't really think about that unless someone forces you to. And that's what the revolutions of 1848 do. They start to organize the people and get them thinking about their own political rights, get them to identify as a social class as opposed to simply an individual, so they can start fighting and rebelling in order to get their rights. This will eventually lead to the abolition of feudalism. We've already seen the abolition of feudalism in places like France, but eventually this will lead to the abolition of feudalism in places like Russia. We also see a massive emigration, as we see here. Many of the people in Europe are going to immigrate to the United States for a whole variety of reasons. One is going to be that Irish potato famine. There's just not enough food, and so many people go to the United States. The second reason is going to be that all of these revolutions fail to turn, they fail to change society. And since they fail to do so, people say, well, I want to go to a place where all of these rights already exist, and that is the United States of America. In 1848, the United States already has pretty much universal male suffrage, where if you're a man, you have the right to vote. And in 1848, the United States has the Seneca Falls Convention. They're already debating on whether they should allow women to vote or not. That's how progressive the United States was. In Europe, most of these societies still have a monarch. And so if you're sitting there in Germany, or you're sitting there in Italy, or you're sitting there in France, and you're looking around and saying, look, I don't like having a monarch. I want to have rights, and I can't get the rights here. These revolutions of 1848 did not get me my voting rights. I'm going to go to the United States where I am allowed to vote. Now, what we see here is that many people from Germany are going to come, especially to the Midwest. And what happens is that the people who are coming to the Midwest from Germany are mainly socialists. They're mainly people who don't like the monarchy. They're mainly people who don't like the military. They're people who want to change things, which is why next year you'll actually learn about the Wisconsin Plan by Robert La Follette, or La Follette, I believe. And you'll see that Wisconsin was a area in which there was a lot of socialist experimentation. Why is there so much socialism in Wisconsin? Well, that's because many German socialists who could not get the changes they want to in Germany came to Wisconsin instead. What does that leave in Germany? That leaves a lot of people who like a strong authoritarian leader and who like using the military. And when we get to Unit 7 and we look at the rise of Adolf Hitler, we'll start to understand why people in Germany really gravitate towards someone who's an authoritarian, strong leader and willing to use the military. Let's go ahead and move on. We're going to talk about nationalism very, very quickly, and then we'll go ahead and end this video. So what is nationalism? Nationalism is an ideology government uses to unify the people. Instead of unifying ourselves based on who our king is, let's unify ourselves based on who we are. Now, there are examples of positive integration and negative integration. Positive integration focuses on who we are. Hey, you speak the same language I do. You live in the same territory. We have a shared history. We have a similar religion. We kind of look like one another. Let's form a country together. That's positive integration. It's focused on who we are as people. Negative integration is focused on who we are not. They are not the same religion we are. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same ethnicity. They don't have the same shared history. We are not them. We are us. We can see that this nationalism can be a very positive thing because it brings people together, but it can be very negative because it creates enemies out of people who are not like us. And we need to keep that in mind because right now we'll be focusing on the positives of nationalism. But when we get to Unit 7, we talk about World War One, and then when we talk about World War II, we'll see the negative aspects of nationalism. The first big nationalist movement in Europe is the Italian unification. We talked about this with the revolutions of 1848. The idea is there because now they have a common enemy in Austria. It just takes a few people in order to unify Italy. The first one is Camille de Cavour. He actually calls upon the French to help defeat the Austrians here in Lombardy, Venetia, right up here, in order to get the Austrians out of Italy. What ends up happening is that the Italians like being Italian more than they like being French. And so they want to unify themselves. They all of a sudden say, you know what, we want to be united, we want to be together. That way we can defend ourselves from Austria and we can defend ourselves from France instead of calling on a bigger nation in order to do so. Niccolo Machiavelli actually said this same exact thing all the way back in the 1500s, but we won't get into that. What we see is Giuseppe Garibaldi. He's a military leader who is going to work his way all the way down the boot and take Sicily. What he does is he unifies all of Italy under Victor Emmanuel, who is going to become King of Italy in 1861. What do we need to get out of this? We need to see that in 1861, Italy is unified because they want to defend themselves from the Austrian Empire. We also see this individual right here, Otto von Bismarck. Now, he's the minister of Prussia under Emperor Wilhelm I. He's not, so Otto von Bismarck isn't the emperor, but he's the right hand man. And he's really the one who's calling the shots. He's really the one who has all of the power. Now, he's going to collect taxes. He's going to grow the military in order to give himself more power. And what he will do is he will engage in something called realpolitik. Realpolitik just means you will do things that are practical and you get things done. For example, if you have to attack your ally nation or if you have to attack your friend in order to make your nation better, then you're going to attack your friend. Most of us would say, well, you shouldn't attack your friend even if it makes sense to do so, even if rationally it would benefit you. But realpolitik says, no, no, no. There's no time to think about allies. There's no time to think about that. You need to do whatever it is you need to do to strengthen your country. And politicians already do this even today. But when you put it out in the forefront and you make it something that actually has a name and you make it something that's acceptable, it's going to happen more and more. And we actually see that with the German unification. In 1862, Otto von Bismarck is going to start the Danish War. He will actually ally with Austria in order to take Schleswig Holstein. I did not nail that one at all. So he actually works with Austria in order to take this area right here. But then 4 years later, in 1866, he's going to engage in the Austro-Prussian War, in which he attacks Austria. And so he originally allied with Austria, then he attacks Austria. That's realpolitik. He's doing what benefits him. He's not worried about, is Austria my ally or not. Now, he doesn't actually take that much land from Austria. What he does is he puts Austria in its place and says, don't mess with us. Don't go to war with us because we will beat you. What his big move is in 1871, he engages in the Franco-Prussian War. This is where Prussia attacks France. And they take this spot right here, Alsace-Lorraine. I'm going to bring up Alsace-Lorraine so many times in this unit, in the next unit, and in Unit 7, because it's going to trade hands. This area between France and what is now Germany is this highly industrialized area. If you have this area, you have a whole lot of raw materials and a whole lot of resources and a lot of industrialization. This is a very rich, wealthy area. But what happens that during the Franco-Prussian War is that Prussia is going to actually take over all of the Holy Roman Empire. So instead of being fragmented, now the Holy Roman Empire is going to be unified, and it's going to be called Germany. Wilhelm I, who was originally the Emperor of Prussia, is now going to be the first Chancellor of Germany, and Germany is going to become this very, very dominant power. So because of the Franco-Prussian War, we get a unified Germany as we see here. I believe this is Wilhelm I, and I believe this is Otto von Bismarck right here. So we now have a unified Italy, and we have a unified Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, that's actually going to wrap up our lesson here. So make sure that you complete the assignment associated with this video. Otherwise, enjoy your winter break, and I will see you when you return back to school in January.